Good evening. My name is Karen Kooni. I'm the director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics. On behalf of the New School, I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to tonight's panel, Getting to Work, Labor Issues in the 21st Century. It is organized by Bookforum in collaboration with the Vera List Center. And like everything touched by Bookforum, the panel represents a subject of great topicality, urgency, and timeliness, and is articulated through voices of an extraordinary group of writers, activists, politicians, journalists, and scholars. I'm grateful for our partnership with Bookforum and would like to especially acknowledge Danielle McConnell, the executive publisher of Bookforum, and Charles Guarino, the executive publisher of Artforum. Chris Lehmann is the moderator of tonight's conversation and will introduce the panelists, Kim Bobo, Thomas Frank, Thomas Geoghegan, and Andrew Ross. Lehmann is the editor of Bookforum, an associate editor for the Baffler, and a columnist for theall.com. He was formerly a senior editor at the Congressional Quarterly Weekly, a columnist for the New York Observer, and deputy editor of Washington Post Book World. Thank you very much for coming. Let's get to work.
Thank you, Karen. Oh, hello. I'm not feeding back, am I? Okay. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Just wanted to give a little background on the reason we gathered all these excellent people here tonight. To borrow a phrase from Marx, and oh, I will, we wanted to sort of put flesh and blood on a specter, which is to say the specter of not communism, which is well and truly dead, as you can read about in the current issue of Bookforum, but rather the specter of social class, of labor and work. This is something in the new global economy you hear very little about, except as something that is continually being raced to the bottom. And especially in the American context, where the denial of social class is something of a civil religion, you see tremendous confusion about what constitutes class identity and what the experience of being a struggling worker is. And I don't really have to point any further than the ongoing Sarah Palin spectacle that we've all been following this past week. This is someone who has positioned herself very cannily as a voice for the culturally disenfranchised. At the same time, she's tirelessly preaching tax cuts for the wealthy as a common sense economic solution to their plight. So that's the kind of problem that informed the thinking behind the fall issue of Bookforum, which is conveniently blown up in gigantic proportion behind me, and just as conveniently should be at all available exits as you leave. We found that there were lots of interesting issues that we addressed in that edition of the magazine, having to do with the expansion of the global market and the place of wage labor, the status of casual workers in the underground economy, and the work of we who are self-styled culture workers who try to advance a broader discussion about these issues. And this is all very well and good in the spirit of high-minded inquiry and the kind of stuff that, as Karen graciously said, we do it all the time at Bookforum. However, the issue took on a certain personal urgency for me because I got laid off from my day job a month and a half ago and was suddenly struck very sharply by the precariousness of labor in the culture industry, which is the subject of Andrew Ross's book. One of the curious things about being separated from a corporate employer in this fashion is the separator dictates all the terms of the separation. So my grievance, oops. my severance agreement was predicated on my signing what's called a non-disparagement clause, which stipulates that I cannot publicly disparage my former employer, which involves all sorts of interesting contradictions because said former employer, I say without any spirit of disparagement, prides itself on trafficking in straight talk about the way Washington really works. And one thing I did realize in reviewing the terms of this clause, though, is that it doesn't govern vocal tone. And I figured since, you're a sophisticated downtown Manhattan audience, I can just report that my company had been purchased by a really cool English publishing conglomerate. And they had the really excellent idea that even though my company was turning a healthy profit in a colossal economic downturn, that our profit margins were about 150% shy of what they wanted them to be. And then they had the really splendid, inspired notion that they would lay off the people who were both represented the cheapest severance packages, i.e. last hired, first fired, and also the people who had a certain penchant for speaking their minds. And again, in the spirit of total non-disparagement, I want to say that's a really far-seeing, brilliant, yes, thank you. Yeah. Especially for a company in the business of doing journalism. Yeah. And in fact, when one of my erstwhile colleagues rose to question the economic logic of these layoffs, pointing out all the really excellent things I just ticked off, he too was fired, which was a really beneficial to morale. Anyway, that's all by way of saying, completely non-disparagingly, that these issues have been driven home with a special force to me. And if any of you have any job tips, I'm happy to talk to you after the panel. By the way, I'm still gainfully employed at Bookforum, which I say without any quasi-ironic disparagement is a fabulous publication that I love to death, and you should all subscribe to multiply. So do not weep for me. But it's my pleasure now to open the discussion to our distinguished panel and to introduce them, and going left to right here. Kim Bobo is the director of Interfaith Worker Justice and a longtime advocate for workers' rights. Her books include Wage Theft in America, published last year, and Lives Matter, a handbook for Christian organizing. Tom Frank is founder and editor of The Baffler, a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and author of The Wrecking Crew, What's the Matter with Kansas, and One Market Under God. Thomas Geoghegan, to my right, is a labor lawyer based in Chicago, where he recently ran for the 5th District congressional seat. His books include Which Side Are You On?, The Law in Shambles, and See You in Court. I think he's also working on a book called Were You Born on the Wrong Continent, which I'm sure he'll explain. And Andrew Ross chairs the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU and is the author of several books, including No Collar, Fast Boat to China, and Nice Work If You Can Get It. And I guess we'll go right to left here, as we hope the political process does. So we can start with Andrew.
Oh, okay. I thought I would thank you for the introduction, and thanks for putting this panel together, a very timely panel. I'm going to make some comments about green jobs, because it seems to me that, can you hear me? Yeah. No, you can, sorry. It seems to me one of the few silver linings in the current recession is the prospect of building a new industrial revolution on the back of green jobs and a clean energy infrastructure. And we know that previous efforts to do this were shut down fairly ruthlessly by the energy cartels. Remember the solar power boomlet in the 1970s. You remember the so-called peace dividend at the end of the Cold War. And even more recently, the Green Jobs Act of 2007, which was passed with a lot of, a good deal of ballyhoo on Capitol Hill, but was not funded at that time. Funny how these things happen. This time around, it seems all of the ingredients are there to make this work, right? The clamorous urgency of climate change is all around us. There seems to be a mandate for sustained government support, at least in the short term. There is a lot of market-friendly incentives on the table, including cap and trade, and the national workforce is in a desperate state, as we know, not just because of the recession, but also has been hollowed out by outsourcing and destabilized by the march of temping and contingency from low-wage sectors into high-wage sectors. So it would seem the green-collar economy is a no-brainer. It's a win-win proposition, even for all these investors, the financial speculators out there who've poured hundreds of billions of dollars into clean energy technologies. And make no mistake about it, we're witnessing another speculative bubble in that regard. It's actually the third bubble since the housing bubble burst. There was the commodities bubble of the spring of 2008. There was the treasury bond bubble that began last year around this time. This is the third one. We're forever blowing bubbles. It was recently reported that Heidi Fleiss, the erstwhile Hollywood madam, has given up her plans to open a bordello for women in Nevada and has decided instead to invest her money in alternative energy. When she was asked why, she echoed, the famous words of bank robber Willie Sutton. She said, "Why? Because that's where the money is." Now, you would think with all of these market-friendly conditions in place, why is it that Van Jones, that Obama's green job czar, was run out of town on a rail after only 5 months in office? It's a good question. The mainstream media consensus was that Jones was Glenn Beck's first scalp among Obama appointees, and an African-American scalp at that. But it soon became clear that the people behind the ouster of Van Jones, it was engineered by the AstroTurf group called Americans for Prosperity, which is one of the primary organizers of the teabagger movement that has so successfully conjured up and marketed populist anger to the media, initially by disrupting these healthcare town hall meetings at the beginning of the summer. Now, the people who fund Americans for Prosperity are not the healthcare insurers or the pharmaceuticals. They're tycoons from the oil industry, like the Koch family. And their #1 goal is the defeat of clean energy legislation, including the very market-friendly cap and trade. Jones, I think quite rightly, was fingered as the most dangerous voice in the Obama administration. Why? Because of his very effective and inspirational advocacy of a green-collar economy. In many ways, he, more than anyone else over the last few decades, has shown why it's important not just for the steelworkers and the Sierra Club to find common cause, but victims of environmental justice and the ranks of unorganized labor have to be part of that picture too. So his slogan, Green for All, and what it encompasses is very much the kind of long wished for red-green alliance. Labor, environmentalists, interfaith groups focused on creation care, and the vast penumbra of social justice groups and organizations, not to mention all these speculators and investors out there who are looking to profit from the good bubble. That's what they call it, the good bubble, the green bubble. That block, if you think about it, has unlimited political potential. And that's why it's such a threat to business as usual for the oil, gas, and coal barons. The fact that there's something in it for capital is important because that's generated a split within the American Chamber of Commerce There's several large corporations that represent a significant fraction of capital have distanced themselves from the Chamber's zealous campaign against climate change legislation. So how has Labour responded to all of this? Let's remember that much better than usual would be what I would say first of all. Organized Labour has been, the response has been much better. Let's remember that the AFL-CIO distanced itself from the international trade union movement by vigorously opposing the Kyoto Treaty. It has consistently supported the most minimal levels of carbon reduction in proposed legislation, and we know that many individual unions have allied with fossil fuel industries in pushing for even lower levels. On the upside, we've seen the rise of the Apollo Alliance, we've seen the rise of the Blue-Green Alliance, spearheaded by the steelworkers, who, it should be said, did support the Kyoto Treaty. And we've even seen individual trade unions launch their own green campaigns. The Teamsters have a green driving campaign, the green building campaign among the construction trade unions. And of course, the AFL-CIO has fulsomely supported the green jobs creation part of the stimulus package. The stimulus package is our substitute for industrial policy making in this country. We don't have an industrial policy in this country. In fact, none of the countries in the Anglo zone have industrial policy. The policy really has been promote growth and then jobs will suddenly appear or somehow appear. That's what passes for industrial policy. Now, having said that, the conservative or defensive hand of Labour is still very much apparent, lobbying against proposed reductions in carbon emissions, even the 15%, which is generally the figure that's on the table in legislation in the House, is considered a little too aggressive for the AFL-CIO. In addition, there are these individual unions which have been on board with the dirty energy industries. The American Clean Energy and Security Act, which was passed through the House in late June, is a case in point. It was a very weak, watered-down version of the bill. It will be weakened even further if and when it gets through the Senate. But part of the watering down was that funding for clean energy research was sliced, and what was boosted was the funding for research into clean coal, $60 billion for funding into carbon capture and sequestration. That's, you know, 60 billion smackaroos. You can imagine what kind of clean energy research could be done with that. And that's just to find out if clean coal works. Never mind, or whether it's just you know, fiction conjured up by the coal industry. We were talking earlier on about how few miners with union cards are left in the coal mining industry. Maybe as few as 6,000. Most of them over 50. They could much more gainful. If coal were phased out, 29% of U.S. emissions are from coal. They could much more gainfully employed, I think, in restoration campaigns to repair damage caused by mountaintop removal, or put to work in a kind of green TVA type structure that could be imagined for the whole of Appalachia. So why protect high carbon jobs in these industries? The answer is fairly obvious. The fear of job loss in this country is so much greater than its equivalent in other industrialized countries because of the tattered nature of the safety net, because of the harsh reality of precarious life in 21st century America, and also because of the very paltry provisions that are in place for displaced workers to transition to new livelihoods. There's another reason, and that other reason, quite frankly, is that it's been a long, long time since Labour had any say in decisions about production. Hasn't been in that position for a long, long time, many decades. I guess the historically minded among us would probably argue that that say in production was bargained away as part of the Treaty of Detroit in 1949. So given that, it's unfair, surely, to blame workers for gas-guzzling auto production, or blame workers for blasting away mountaintops and so on and so forth. Having said that, decarbonization, I think, cannot and should not be seen as a threat to the labor movement. It's an opportunity. It's a way back in. It's an opportunity to yet again have some say in production, to take on lead and innovation in production in ways that labor hasn't been in a position of doing for several decades. Time, however, is very limited to seize that opportunity. The fiasco of Copenhagen lies before us, to remind us of the long-term horizon, maybe even the short-term horizon, how much time we have. And there's a very short window, it seems, or we would have to assume there's a short window in Washington for sustained government support and job creation of decent jobs, Bacon-Davis jobs that are decently paid, and with benefits and access to bargaining rights. Just bear in mind that a lot of the existing jobs in the wind and solar industries are really shitty jobs and pay about maybe half of the average national manufacturing wage. So I will just end and conclude by saying that if the Sierra Club can campaign for the Employee Free Choice Act, and it has been doing that, and that's a huge step for the Sierra Club, given its history. If the Sierra Club can do that, then the United Mine Workers can and should be joining the fight for climate justice. This blue-green alliance, this red-green alliance, blue, red, green, whatever you want to call it, has been a long time coming in this country. And in many ways, the Teamster and Turtles together moment at the Battle of Seattle 10 years ago was something of a false dawn. Today, there really is no alternative. It's no longer just a question of getting a fair deal or a share of power. Life on the planet is going down the tubes if alliances of this kind really don't hold up and sustain themselves and make their impact felt. So I'll leave you with that sense of urgency. Thanks.
Thank you. And that actually furnishes a very good segue into what Tom is going to discuss, which involves the depoliticization of the labor world.
Well, I'm a union side lawyer in Chicago. I'm glad to hear the Sierra Club is supporting FCA because I don't hear much hue and cry for it out in the country generally. And that, I think, is a puzzle. Outside of the environs of New School, why isn't there more anger, worker solidarity, debate about or demand for labor law reform? Why is it such a dead issue, even in this time? Why are the unions unable to connect with working people in this country? I think the whole labor law model has to change. And I should start out by saying, I'm a union side lawyer. I've been paid by unions. I've supped at labor's table. I love labor unions. And I have written a book arguing for card check and everything that is in FCA, and I support it 10,000%. On the other hand, if it passes, it's probably going to add just another level of alienation between working people and the unions. And I think that while we can talk endlessly about the depredations of American capitalism, we have a model of opposing capitalism that isn't working. Why isn't it working? I think there are two reasons why it's not working. No voice, no exit. Albert Hirschman, who is somebody you guys should all be reading somewhere at the New School, and I read a million years ago, wrote an essay about exit and voice in organizations. And if I were to pick one difference between the American labor movement and the European labor movements, and I think any labor movement in any country on the planet that is working right now, the difference is in America, labor has no exit, no voice for their members, and in other countries, that's all they emphasize. So, for example, in France, in Germany, how does labor work? Everybody is a volunteer. You sign up, and anybody can get in. You know, it's an odd thing. I'm not a member of a labor union. I don't know any union-side lawyer who's not working in an in-house legal department who is a member of a labor union. It's extraordinary. You know, in Germany and France, you run into people even at the top, even government bureaucrats, even bosses who are union members, because they believe in unionism, they pay the dues voluntarily, they have this act of solidarity with others, and it is an act of solidarity, unlike any that we can perform here, because it is voluntary. It is given. It is a gift that I give voluntarily. People who are in the labor movement, who are card-carrying union members, are in it involuntarily. They rarely have any voice. It's imposed upon them, and they can't get out. They can resign from union membership in a technical way, but they still have to pay a fair share. They are taxed, essentially, when labor comes in and represents them. And what does their money go for? It goes to me. It goes to people like me. It goes to union business agents. And what do? We defend the people who are the most marginal, usually, in the organization. We defend the people who don't show up on time, who are absentee, who are late, because we've got to go through the grievance process. All of this is shoved onto labor and paid for involuntarily by everybody out of their dues. Do you see a reason why people who feel that they're powerless to begin with, even though they don't like their employer, may not want to bring in an organization that is going to add another level of alienation, that they also don't have any control over, that they can't opt out of? I don't think that the German unions, the French unions, the Swedish unions are especially more democratic in their structures than the United States. But they have to be responsive to their members because the members can walk out. They don't have to pay the dues. It is all voluntary. Imagine the following reform, where we went to the AFL-CIO and said, and this is an unfair thing to ask, but just imagine it for a second. Why don't you operate exactly the way the German, the French, and the Swedish labor unions do, where you've got all these enthusiastic rank-and-file people, and just take dues voluntarily. Tell the people you represent, you don't have to pay us anything. If you don't want to send dues in, that's fine. We're only taking voluntary contributions. Now, the kick here is that in the United States, you can only get contributions from a segment that is elected. It's really kind of a throwback, an archaic kind of collectivist, almost a Soviet-type model, whereas the socialist countries, if we may call them that, European socialist countries, operate on a much more capitalist market model. They go out and they market union membership. They go out and what do? They write the most scurrilous things about the United States and capitalism. They go way to the left. Why are they doing that? Because it sells union memberships. And that's what they're in the business of doing. In the United States, we don't sell anything. We don't sell because the dues come in automatically. Even if people are pissed off at us, all they have to do is resign, and they only lose a little increment. We still get about 85% of the money. So there really isn't any strong, shall we say, business motive to go out and market unionism to other people and to conform to the kind of labor movement people want and to pull in the true believers, the way they do in France, the way they do in Germany, who go out and push the cause because they're paying for it out of their own pockets voluntarily because they care about it. We don't have anything like that spark here. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why they have their system and we have ours. And I don't want to end up saying, well, I think that the union should just take dues voluntarily from now on, or they should abandon this whole EFCA approach, which is a way in which the labor movement controls who gets organized and who doesn't. I've proposed a different approach, civil rights, amendment to the Civil Rights Act, and let everybody go out and bring their own kind of lawsuits and start their own unions anytime that there's discrimination, go directly into federal court the way we do under civil rights laws. So that the unions, part of the reason for this is that the unions don't control the process, and you have people who decide that they want to get out there and push a labor union at their plant. They can do it without having the sanction of big labor in Washington telling the NLRB it's okay to process this one. I'm not pushing those things. What I am saying is that we've got to think about the fact that the structure we have right now is a very unappetizing one for pulling people in and creating the sense of solidarity and excitement. It's been a tough 30 years for labor. We haven't been able to raise anybody's dues. In fact, they've gone down in real terms as productivity has gone up. We haven't stopped outsourcing. We haven't been able, as a political movement, to get anything for our base. I think the last thing we got was Medicare in 1964 that really meant anything to people. So people may wonder, you know, why bring this service in if they don't feel enthusiastic about it, don't feel that they have some part in it. The one thing that I would urge as a recommendation that I think labor could do, even under the existing legal system, I really think that, like the Europeans who are moving towards works councils on the German model, and it's not just the Germans, it's the French and the Belgians and others, that labor ought to offload all this grievance handling that it now does to works councils that are independent of the unions and the workers themselves control, and that are funded not by the unions but by the companies, although they're elected by the workers, and let the workers themselves make decisions about who goes, who's going to stay, who gets axed in a layoff. And labor concentrate on two things: wage bargaining and being a political movement that at the national level is going to push enthusiastically for things like, well, I hope single-payer national health care after whatever happens on this thing gets done with. And even a civil rights to join a union. That's the kind of thing that labor has got to do. It's got to focus in a new way on winning hearts and minds of people. And it may be giving up some of the security blanket that labor has had for a long time.
Wow, okay. Lots to discuss there. So in the spirit of moving things along, I give you Thomas Frank.
All right, and I will try to keep it short because somebody was supposed to go out and get beer. Did he go? Is there beer, Danny? He's not. All right, now when I first got interested in labor, the question that my friends and I used to always argue about was how unions ought to be spending their resources. On politics, should they be spending their money and their efforts to get Democrats elected? Or should they be spending their resources on organizing and growing their own ranks? And for me, back in those days, this always seemed like pretty much a no-brainer. I mean, obviously, the better strategy is organizing, right? You're building your own movement into a power again, and then letting the politicians follow along afterwards, as is their want. Besides, you know, there's few things in life as disappointing as waiting for the Democrats to come around and do what you've elected them to do. But if you look a little closer, it's not as simple as that. The reason it's so hard to organize unions is not because people don't want to be organized, you know, not because people don't like the idea of bargaining with their boss. In fact, what was it? Jim McNeil was telling me earlier today. See, we all know who Jim McNeil is here, right?
Yeah.
Was telling me earlier today that according to a poll of working people done, I guess, a couple of years ago, the number of people who would like to join unions is at around 60%. But the reason we don't join unions is because management has so many weapons at its disposal to ensure that we don't join unions. Look, the business community, if you've watched TV over the last couple of years, you know this, that the business community likes to equate unions with, hell, I work for the Wall Street Journal. The business community loves to equate unions with criminals, with bosses, with corrupt politics. They even run TV commercials that establish the stereotype. But of course, it's management themselves who have no problem with intimidation and coercion. And these are basically the everyday tools of what they call union avoidance. And companies routinely use them when their employees get uppity and try to organize. Threats to move the operation overseas if the union wins the election, compulsory meetings to listen to anti-union propaganda, termination for select pro-union employees. By the way, before I don't want to badmouth my employer either. These are all things that I've written in the Wall Street Journal, so everybody there knows my opinion. Now, these things that I'm talking about are so well known that they've been the subject of reports by Human Rights Watch. I mean, they've been written about by academics. They've been quantified with scientific precision. There's a study done in 2000 by Kate Bronfenbrenner of Cornell University that I was using for this, and among her findings, in 51% of union organizing drives, management made some sort of threat to close the business down if the union won the election. That's in more than half. The number is 68% in what the study defined as mobile industries, industries that where you actually could make good on the threat. They make this threat in 68% of these occasions. In 75% of companies that face union elections brought in management consultants. I'm actually surprised it's not higher. 92% made employees attend what they call captive audience meetings, right, where you have to go. 67% had employees attend weekly supervisor one-on-one meetings, and you get one guess what goes on at those meetings. 70% sent out anti-union letters, 55% showed anti-union videos, 34% gave bribes or special favors to anti-union employees, and 25% simply fired the pro-union employees, the ringleaders, right? Just round them up and fire them. So the way union elections are held, it turns out, has to be changed before you can expect organizing to succeed. There's really just no way that the labor movement can go anywhere when it's facing those kind of practices. And so the only way to do that is, of course, to change the law, which brings you back to politics. I mean, it's a frustrating business, isn't it? And specifically, it brings you back to the proposal that Tom was just disparaging, which is known as card check, right? EFCA, which they're debating down in Washington. Well, they've been debating it ever since the Democrats got in earlier this year. And the idea is, of course, that you can form a union in your workplace by collecting a majority of signed cards rather than by holding an election. Now, this would, as you might imagine, this would fundamentally change the workplace equation. Tom has come up with, we'll get into that later. Basically, there's all these ideas out there that would completely change the way unions and management square off against one another, and this is one of the most potent ones. And it would, obviously make it, hugely easy to form a union. You just be able to download the cards off the internet. The guys down at Starbucks would, or something like that, get their fellow employees to sign them, and lo and behold, you've got a union in a matter of minutes. And so, obviously, the business community has fought this proposal with every weapon at their disposal. Consultants, TV commercials, lobbyists, and this amazing array of front groups that we've got down in DC. And I have a friend who does nothing but study these groups, and he's got this chart on his wall showing who funds them and who's in them, and all the pseudonyms that they're using. It's a fascinating story. But anyhow, if you listen to those consultants and those lobbyists, what they'll tell you is that this is a kind of holy war, that this is a battle over the most sacred democratic institution of them all, right? The secret ballot, which labor is supposedly threatening. Well, they are sort of, in a way, threatening to take it away. Now, however, this is, I'm sure, is going to come as an enormous shock to everybody in this room. Democracy really isn't the main concern of card check's opponents. It's the unions themselves. More unions means they'd have to pay higher wages. They'd have to give more benefits, and they would, yes, have to deal with more democracy in the workplace, with workers having a say through their organization. So if Walmart employees were to get a union through card check or something like that, then it's a pretty fair bet that they wouldn't have to work after they've punched out for the day. Kim is going to tell you about how that one works. So look, for all of its flaws, card check is about power at the end of the day. Management has it, workers don't, and business doesn't want that to change. Consider the remarks made by Walmart CEO Lee Scott last October when someone asked him about the possible coming of card check. He said, "We like driving the car, and we're not going to give the steering wheel to anybody but us." Right? That's what it's about. We've got the steering wheel. We don't want them, we like driving. And here are the lamentations of the billionaires. This is Bernie Marcus, founder and former CEO of the Home Depot, during a conference call on the subject of card check before last year's election that I happened to listen in on. This is the demise of a civilization, he said. This is how a civilization disappears. I'm sitting here as an elder statesman and I'm watching this happen and I don't believe it. And he went on, talked about how the unions would go after the low-hanging fruit and would organize workers in industry after industry, and we were all going to be on the line sooner or later. And he had taken it upon himself, he said, to notify the nation's CEOs of the danger, but they were not yet grabbing for their guns. And he said, this is as important as anything that's ever happened to these companies. And they're not reacting, they're not fighting. The old-time fighters are gone. But in the class war, as in the, this is me speaking again, in the class war, as in the real deal, there's always ways of motivating the yellow. Back to Bernie Marcus. If a retailer has not gotten involved with this, if he has not spent money on this election, if he has not sent money to Norm Coleman, you remember him, and all these other guys, meaning U.S. senators, he should be shot, Marcus declared. They should be thrown out of their goddamn jobs. Like Chris here. Sorry, that's
I gave money to Norm Coleman for nothing? Shit.
Now, I should acknowledge that about, looking at card check and the sort of incredibly feeble efforts by the unions to try to get it passed, if the whole thing isn't just some kind of crazy jujitsu that they're trying to pull. I mean, the mere threat, think about it, the mere threat of card check has got businesses basically glowing like as pink as Pepto-Bismol in their fake concern for the proletariat. By the way, I just read Sarah Palin's memoir, and it's filled with sort of working class signifiers. She goes on and on and on about Carhartt clothes, Carhartt this, Carhartt that. She's going to dress up her baby in Carhartt, infant clothes or something like that. Okay, I made that part up, but she does talk about how he's going to grow up and wear Carhartts when he gets bigger and all this sort of thing. Oh, sorry. But you think about it, this feigned concern for the proletariat that all of these front groups in D.C. are exhibiting, right? The Chamber of Commerce, for example, is running commercials right now exhorting the public to stand up for workers' rights. The Chamber of Commerce is in favor of workers' rights. They're running something called a workforce freedom airlift. Workforce freedom airlift. I want to ride that, man. And along with various other trade associations, is supporting groups with names like Coalition for a Democratic Workplace. Yes, they want a democratic workplace. They want everyone to have a vote at work, right? And the Workforce Fairness Institute, right? That's what the Chamber of Commerce is all about. So you look at these things and you think that maybe one of these days what the supporters of card check will do is just drop all the most controversial demands that they've been making and turn around and spend the next 20 years reminding corporate America and the Chamber of Commerce of the days when they were so touchingly committed to workers' rights and a democratic workplace, and we're going to fly us all in on a worker democracy airlift or whatever it is. But that's actually not going to happen. The only clever reversal that you ever see in Washington, D.C., the only kind of clever jujitsu move is the familiar one where certain Democrats torpedo the most trustworthy member of their own coalition. They've got look at this, they got a bulletproof majority in both houses of Congress. They passed card check when George W. Bush was president. Of course, he vetoed it. But now they can't get it. Now it's going nowhere this time. Now, why is that? We'll talk about some of that stuff later. But the obvious answer is, of course, the money, right? You consider the lineup of lobbyists that retail giant Walmart, just to name one, has assembled to make its own case against card check. If you look up their disclosure forms, they have to file these with the U.S. Senate, who's lobbying for you on different measures. You find Liz is lobbying for Walmart against card check. John Kerry's liaison to Congress from 2004, I forget his name, a former legislative director for Rahm Emanuel, former assistant to Arkansas Senator Blanche Lincoln. And by the way, the Arkansas delegation, the Democrats in the Arkansas delegation have been instrumental in stopping card check. Walmart has also, of course, secured the services of Tony Podesta, principal of the Podesta Group, which is the hottest lobby shop in Democratic D.C. There's a big story in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago about this restaurant that he likes to hang out at called Tosca, and all the lobbyists, apparently. It is the most excellent place to be eating your lunch. And anyhow, he's working for Walmart these days. He's, of course, the brother of, we'll go into that later. Anyhow, the real standout on Walmart's labor issues roster, though, was the DNP firm, which wears its liberalism as proudly as our friends, the Tea Partiers, do their three-cornered hats. If you go on their website of the DNP lobby outfit, you'll find this. Here's what when they're explaining what they do. They highlight partnership, shared benefits, and a commitment to advancing social justice goals. Their disclosure form for their Walmart card check stuff lists as one of their lobbyists a former assistant to Hilda Solis, the labor secretary. Where's that beer? I need the goddamn beer. If you read the biography of the principal of the firm, Ingrid Duran, who's also listed as a Walmart lobbyist on the card check issue, it declares that her firm's mission, and this is a quote from their website, to increase the role of corporate, legislative, and philanthropic efforts in addressing the concerns of Latinos, women, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities. And that's very nice, but of course, labor gets it in the neck. And I think that the day will come, of course, when those communities that she mentions are correctly addressed by corporations and philanthropists. But when their concerns turn in the direction of bargaining with their employers, they should remember they're on their own. Democrats aren't here to help. Thank you very much.
See, I've cleverly sequenced things so that you're really depressed right now, and that's when we bring on Kim Bobo.
Well, thank you. I am indeed honored to be on such a distinguished panel. And after you read all our books, I also want you to read The Big Squeeze by Steve Greenhouse. Steve, wave at us. One of the best books in the country. You can read that one first and then ours. Any order is fine. I come to this panel and the work as a whole, not as a researcher, writer, or philosopher, but merely as an activist called by my faith, trying to make the world a little bit better place. So what I want to do in my time tonight is quickly explain how I stumbled into wage theft, review what is wage theft and why we have such a crisis, share what we as Interfaith Worker Justice, the organization I direct, what we're doing trying to stop and deter wage theft, and of course ask you to join us, and then offer a few additional reflections, and I'll try and go fast because I know I'm at the end and you've been listening a long time. So how I stumbled into wage theft. In 1996, I started Interfaith Worker Justice with the mission of engaging the religious community in low-wage worker issues. And my vision on it primarily was that we would work supporting the labor movement on organizing fights and contract fights. And we had kind of a core mission that we would build structures around the country to engage on these labor issues. And in fact, we now have 50 religion labor groups around the nation that do just that. Second, that we would create resources for the religious community. We've done that. So we've got Presbyterians and worker justice, Jews and worker justice, Muslims and worker justice. You name it, we've got it in terms of resources for the religious community on labor issues. We wanted to engage future young religious leaders because when you looked at the religious community who understood these issues of labor, they were mostly gray hair, and many have since died since we started the organization. So in fact, we needed to build a new base. We've done that. We've got thousands of new young religious leaders engaged in labor issues. Two last things we were going to do. Fourth was we were going to engage the religious employers because I thought that they just didn't understand how their union busting hurt workers. And if I just explained it to the nuns, it would all be okay. Well, I did that for a few years and got absolutely nowhere, so we're not really doing much of that right now. And then when I met with Richard Bensinger at the time, who was the organizing director of the AFL-CIO, he said, the big thing that's going to happen in the labor movement is we're going to organize the poultry industry. And I said, okay, well, I'm there. I want to organize. So I organized all this religious support for the poultry fight, and then that fell apart, and I was left with worker centers in the middle of poultry industry all over the nation. What a mess. But anyway, so that was our mission. So we get going in this work a few years in, and pastors start sending us these random workers who haven't gotten paid. You know, so you try and you spend the day trying to help them and realize, oh, this is not going well. And so, you know, I get a bunch of restaurant workers. I call my friends at, you know, at the time at HERE, you're the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union. I've got 20 workers in a restaurant who haven't gotten paid. Could you help them? No. We're not doing restaurants this year. Yes, but they want to organize. No, Kim, that's not our priority. Okay, so I'm like, all right, well, all right, we can't organize. I can't handle all these individual calls. So maybe if I do a worker rights manual, I can just send it to people. So first I call around. I'm in Chicago. Call around. Are there any worker rights manuals? There were no worker rights manuals in the great labor city of Chicago. So then I assigned an intern to spend 2 weeks writing one. Well, it took a little longer than that. And I realized that there were all these government agencies that were open from 9 to 5. They didn't speak languages other than English. And no one in their right mind could figure out all these laws and these agencies. Anyway, out of this, we ended up creating a worker center in Chicago, basically kind of a drop-in center, kind of like the Jewish labor lyceums, like the Catholic labor schools, like the settlement houses, that are kind of an alternative structure to try and support workers who were not getting paid. Well, then we had more of these getting started, some of which we started, a bunch of others which were started independently and affiliated with us. And we've now got 23, 24 worker centers affiliated with us. The number one problem these worker centers see is workers not getting paid. Wage theft is the number one problem. Now, folks come in with other problems, but by far, they've not gotten paid. So that's wage theft. What is it exactly? It is employers not paying the minimum wage. There was a phenomenal new study done a couple months ago by the National Employment Lawyers Project, NELP, that said, it basically surveyed more than 4,000 low-wage workers in LA, Chicago, and New York. Now, recognize that these are in 3 states that actually have decent labor laws and have enforcement agencies, you know, as opposed to Florida, which has none, or Alabama, which has 3 staff people, or, you know, so like you got a good chance in those states. And the survey showed in those cities, these 4,000 workers, low-wage workers, 26% of folks weren't paid the minimum wage, right? 26%. On overtime, if you worked overtime, it found that 76% of folks weren't paid overtime. And then there's misclassifying workers as independent contractors instead of employees. Now, it sounds like just a paperwork error, right? But if you are misclassified, it means not only are you not getting overtime, you're not getting unemployment insurance, you're not getting workers' comp, you're not eligible for OSHA protections and family medical leave. I mean, you're just exempt from all what little labor laws we have. You're excluded from that. Lowest numbers I've seen are that 3 million workers in the nation are misclassified. The head of some enforcement stuff here in New York State around misclassification said, Kim, I bet the numbers are 2-3 times that in the country. Huge, huge problem in the nation. Then there's all the off-the-clock work, right? So, you know, you clock out and then you have to keep working. You know, probably Walmart's, of course, the poster child on wage theft. They've finally decided to settle 63 different lawsuits for stealing wages. And as Steve so well describes in one of his chapters, the managers would go into the timesheets, and if it said inside the timesheet in the computer 43, 45, 44 hours, they'd just shave it off and say 40 hours, right? Shaving hours, off the clock. Then there's tip stealing. The survey showed that more than 10% of workers' tips are stolen on a regular basis. And it's not just the stuff you put on your credit card, which is a problem, but it's also, you know, those tip jars at Starbucks, the tip jars at Dunkin' Donuts, you know, those get shared with the managers as well, blatantly illegal. Then there's the last paycheck problem. You get fired, you don't get your paycheck. You get laid off, you don't get it. You resign, you don't get it. It's always been a problem, this last paycheck stuff. But in this economy, it's even worse. Right? That's what we saw with Republic Doors and Windows. Y'all seen the Michael Moore movie? Did you see? I'm in the movie. I haven't seen it. I've just heard. But apparently, my face flashes by, so look for it. You know, don't blink, but I'm in there. And I'm told, again, I haven't seen it, but I'm told you can hear me singing, because I'm kind of known for leading singing and prayer things. So I'm in there, so listen for my voice, and you say, I know that voice. And then there's the day laborers who work all day and don't get paid at all. Almost every day laborer you talk to has had that experience. Now, this NELP study said that workers are underpaid on average $51 a week. That's $2,500 a year for workers making $18,000, $19,000 a year. That's a lot of stolen wages in the society. So it is a major crisis, not a small problem, a huge crisis. So what are we doing to try and stop and deter wage theft? First, we've got this network of worker centers that are trying to help workers recover stolen wages. And we do that in a variety of ways. We hook people up to wonderful lawyers like Tom down the way and say, you know, help them file a case. We hook them up to union organizers when we can find some that will take them in their industries. But frankly, the thing we've had the best record with is just going to employers. So let me give you an example. I got our Chicago Workers Center a couple months ago sent out a little email that said, you know, you don't have anything to do on Tuesday night. Show up at one of the homemade pizza stores in Chicago. It's kind of a chain restaurant in Chicago. And I'm like, well, I can do that. Because what had happened was there were a group of pizza restaurant workers that were putting the pepperoni on the pizzas. It's kind of like you buy these to-go pizzas. So they were putting on it, and they were asked to put on stale pepperoni. And so these workers said, we don't want to put stale pepperoni on the pizza. We don't think that's a good idea. And so the owner fired them and said, I'm not going to pay you for your last paycheck. So the workers said, okay, well, let's go to the worker center and see if we can find out. So we go in, start looking at their paychecks, and realize they not only hadn't gotten their last paycheck, but they weren't paid minimum wage, and they weren't being paid overtime, right? I mean, the whole range of things. So we first tried to call the owner and said, you know, will you go ahead and pay him? And he said, no, I'm not going to pay him, and called us not nice names. And so then we said, all right, so we got to take it up. So they sent out this email, will you show up at one of these 6 different locations? You know, so the location nearest my house I go to, there's about several of the workers going to lead the delegation. Then there's about 15 others of us to help out. And kind of the younger folks with whatever, they you know, handed out flyers outside on the street that said, don't buy pizza topped with exploitation. And then the rest of us, you know, the workers and some of the older gray hairs went into the restaurant and said, you know, we'd like you to call the owner and say, will you pay these workers? And they said, well, we don't have the number. And I said, well, I got it right here. Handed him the cell phone. They called the owner. You know, he got calls all over the city from the restaurants. 20 minutes later, he called the Workers Center screaming at us. 2 days later, he shows up with his lawyer. 3 days later, he pays them all the money they're owed, right? Now, we're faster than the lawyers, right? And we're engaging, not only workers are involved in fighting this stuff, but it's engaging allies in understanding really what's going on in the society. So the direct action, I think, is an incredibly effective thing to do. Secondly, a number of the worker centers are really trying to go after whole industries, right? Is there a way we can clean up an industry in our town and make a difference? Thirdly, there's a whole set of local wage theft enforcement efforts underway. So Cincinnati has a new misclassification task force in the Hamilton County area. In Fayetteville, they're trying to pass an ordinance that would make it a criminal act to steal wages from workers. In Chicago, looking at the same thing. Miami's trying to get their Human Relations Commission to take on wage theft. So there's all these local efforts to try and address it in some different ways. Then we're working on national legislation. We're working on a package of 3 bills. One, which would change the statute of limitations related to the Department of Labor getting back wages for folks. Second, a mandate that every employer must provide a pay stub. Now, I know that doesn't sound like such a big deal, but for workers who get paid in cash, it's hard to figure out, you know, what are you getting paid for, and are you getting cheated or whatever. And so one of the main indicators of people not getting paid is if they're paid in cash. You know, it's a real problem for folks. And thirdly, that the Department of Labor must work in partnership with these worker centers and groups around the nation, that it is not enough for them to try and do the work by themselves. They got to be working with us. Then the last main area of work on trying to stop and deter wage theft is really trying to push the Department of Labor to do its job. Now, praise God, we have a new Secretary of Labor. But, you know, it's a big ship. And it has a whole long pattern of how it does things. And I literally yesterday helped organize a meeting to meet with almost all the top leadership in the Wage and Hour Division and some in OSHA as well. Basically, our message to them was, look, we're delighted you're there, you know, much better than who we had before. We like what you're saying. It's a really good message that you want to enforce the law, but frankly, it ain't trickling down right now. And on the ground, we're not seeing many changes, so we're here to help. That was kind of the message. But, you know, we view that part of our job right now is to be pushing the Department of Labor, even though they're our friends, right? I walked in the room and I knew half the people in the room, but they still have to be pushed to really move this stuff because it's a crisis out there around the country. All right, let me close by just adding a few other random reflections related to the state of labor in the nation at this moment. First is, I think we have trouble remembering who the real enemy is. The fighting right now in the labor movement is a huge detriment, not just to the unions involved, but to all of us who are supporters of labor in this country. So I'm not sure what the answer is. Prayer is helpful, but probably something else needs to happen here. But it is, in fact, I think, demoralizing for many of us who stand in support of labor. Secondly, we do have a labor movement that is not known for fighting for core standards for all workers in this nation. You know, it's the line, we want justice, not just for us, right? And it is, we do need to figure out how we can raise the core standards for everybody and not just protect sort of high-wage jobs for a few. Again, I know that labor leaders understand this, but it is in fact something that people don't believe that the labor movement completely fights for them, which is, you know, a huge problem for us in this nation. Thirdly, we do have an American exceptionalism. We're special, and we really don't need to learn from anybody else in the world. And since our labor laws go back to 1930 and everybody else has like progressed in the world, I think there's probably a few things we could learn from folks. EFCA, I am concerned, will not be the panacea that we would like it to be. You know, I've spent the last year of my life engaging people in support of the Employee Free Choice Act. but I am deeply concerned that whatever passes, that employers will find ways around it quickly. And if you know, what folks are talking about now is that there might be an expedited election process with an 8-day window. And frankly, the biggest problem we have with the labor community in terms of partners with the religious community is that they call us at the last minute, right? You know, we've got a strike, or we've got a vote coming up in 2 weeks, can you come help us? What's going to happen now is we'll get the call 8 days ahead of time, and we can't possibly engage the religious community in an 8-day time period, which means we've got to be starting those relationships and partnerships much sooner than that, and we don't have a good track record of doing that around the country. You know, and then finally, we got to have immigration reform. You know, we got 12 million workers that are afraid to come see the light of day, and they are potential sort of leaders and are leaders right now around the country in this fight for labor rights. And I just, if I see such courageous leadership from people who are afraid they could be deported by just stepping forward, and they're doing it anyway, right? And so if they're doing that anyway, imagine what kind of dynamic labor leadership we would see if people felt safe to speak up in the society. So it's an interesting time to be doing this work. I think there's enormous opportunities, but a few challenges before us.
Thank you. I want to sort of initiate a discussion within the panel and then go directly to questions, because I know we're running a little late. But I just wanted to pick up on, I'm claiming moderator prerogative here. Tom, your ideas about sort of starting over, in essence, in reviewing the relationship specifically between the labor movement and labor law got me thinking, when both the other Tom and Kim were talking, a lot of the challenge, you know, the kind of immediate challenges facing organized workers right now is getting the state to do its job, and also to, you know, move the state forward. And I'm just wondering, in your, you know, experience in Europe and thinking about these all-volunteer models for union activism, do those unions lobby? I mean,
Sure.
What's the model for pushing the state forward, in other words?
These labor movements are, organized labor in other countries is connected up with the Labor Party.
Well, yes.
But I think the bigger problem is really a cultural one that Kim has hit upon. It's not that government isn't doing its job. Of course, it's not. That's always true. The bigger question I have is, why are people letting this happen? And why is it that, and I've represented the people that Kim talks about only on rare occasions, because it's very rare that they get to a lawyer. When they do, my experience is they don't know what a union is. Never really heard of one, have only the vaguest idea of what a union is, much less, you know, getting paid on a regular basis. That is true at every single income level in this country. I think more and more Americans simply don't know what a union is. Why is it that these people are putting up with wage theft? That's the astonishing thing. And it takes only a minimal amount of education to get them mad. It's not that hard to do something. If you know that you're being ripped off, it's not that hard to get it fixed. But to get people to realize that they're being violated in some way, that's really tough. And that comes from a culture in which the unions have just been sucked out of it for all sorts of reasons. Many of them, most of them, pushed on by other forces, a lot of them self-inflicted. And what we have to do is to create a culture in which people understand that labor is part of the society, that they have to be treated with dignity and so forth. That's a huge education job. And I'm all in favor of lobbying government. I do it myself. But government isn't the answer. The answer is to get people mad about it and not to tolerate it. How does that happen? I think that the labor movement in particular ought to be pushing two things. One is giving people some control over their work lives and creating new institutions like the works councils, co-determination, that put labor in the process and don't have the unions in between the people and their worker representatives, so that, you know, in works councils you elect each other up there. The second thing is education, 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 whether it's mentoring and apprenticeship programs, civics education in the schools, some way of transmitting the culture down. Take IG Metall in Germany, huge union. It's the manufacturing union, so to speak. It's the United Auto Workers, it's the steel workers, it's all of it in one big package. What do you think the drop in the membership has been after all the deindustrialization, contracting out, restructuring of German industry, a bashing of labor over the years from 1973 to the present? What do you think their membership drop has been? Remember, this is like their steel workers, their auto workers. It's 10%. And right now, it's on the upswing. The membership is actually increasing. Where does the increase come from? Volunteers, people under age 27. It's the fastest growth there. It increases like 6%, 7%, that age segment. Why is that happening? Education, apprenticing, mentoring, putting unions back into the culture in a major way. And when that happens, you don't have to worry about wage theft. It won't happen. But you've got to change people's consciousness about labor, about their rights, about their ability to speak out, about their sense of control over their lives.
Yes. Andrew, did you have a follow-up
I guess I'll just add a few comments.
Sure.
I think, you know, one of the reasons why there's a quietism at this point in time is because we're really still in a honeymoon period as far as the Obama administration goes, and certainly that is the case with organized labor. I mean, they've been shut out of the White House for so long. I mean, George Bush never made so much as a phone call to the AFL-CIO, never mind anyone else in organized labor during 8 years. Suddenly they're on the inside. You know, Anna Berger, Rich Trumka sit in the Economic Recovery Board. They're sitting pretty to some degree right now, and the right knows this, and they know that this period of quietism, and that's why the right's been so active, because they really feel they can command the field of play. On the issue, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons, but I think we're still early on in this recession as far as pushback and resistance and labor militancy goes. I think the next year, the next 2 years is going to be a significant shift. As far as Tom's point about ignorance of unions at almost every wage level, for sure that is the case, but there's something about solidarity that you don't inherit or take for it. It has to be learned. Solidarity has to be learned. Being in a trade union is one way of doing that. It's not the only way, but it's not. Even if you grow up in that culture and it's passed down, it's still not something that people connect with unless they actually experience it, and that can come in any number of ways, whether it's in the union movement or not. So I think there's more to the issue than simply ignorance or just not knowing what a union does, which is certainly part of the problem, but I think there's more to it than that.
And I also just wanted to briefly follow up. I was interested in your analysis of the green jobs kind of impasse we're at right now. And when the other Tom was talking about the jujitsu possibilities out there, it occurred to me that you know, one objection to a industry labor alliance on green jobs is industry is far and away the more potent partner. And I'm wondering, perhaps in the spirit of increased militance, if you've thought of ways that, you know, that kind of alliance, which could take on the aura of AstroTurf, could actually be you know, much more effectively, you know, bottom up.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question because, you know, industry, there are many different fractions, and right now the split in the American Chamber of Commerce is kind of interesting. And most recently, the AFL-CIO has been putting a lot of pressure on the idea for the next round of stimulus. You know, the next round of stimulus package is going to be about job creation, most directly. And they've been putting their voice behind this idea that it's small businesses that have to be supported and stimulated and subsidized because they're the most likely to provide employment. And there's a lot of reasons for that, of course. This split in the American Chamber of Commerce kind of reminds me of the last big split which happened in the National Association of Manufacturers in the early years of this century. The smaller businesses who could not move offshore really had a huge disagreement with the multinationals who pretty much control policy making within the NAM. And it was a very acrimonious split. These are different fractions of capital. And to some degree, this is being played out again, I think, in the American Chamber of Commerce or in this latest move, because, you know, what I like, with apologies to a certain rock star from Minneapolis, the people formerly known as employers, which is a phrase I like, people who've pretty much lost the habit or the appetite for creating domestic jobs. The bigger the kind of organization, the less of a habit and appetite they have. It's really the smaller businesses that are more likely to create the jobs, and I think that's part of the reason. That is why we're seeing, however, in the green collar economy, this big debate about the role of China again, and it's quite different from the debate at the earlier part of the century, around about 2002, when the multinationals were taking the jobs to China. This time it's Chinese investors who are moving in on the subsidies that are available in this country for solar and wind farms and so on and so forth. And the scenario, and Joe Biden has been kicking back in this recently, the scenario is that the Chinese investors leave their supply chain intact in China, where all the best paying jobs are, and the operations they bring here are assembly and installation jobs, which are the least paying.
Right.
And so the irony of this is really quite significant. I think that the U.S. increasingly now is seen as an assembly, a place of assembly, in the way in which South China used to be not that long ago. But you're going to see Chinese investors coming here for that purpose, the last, a different kind of last paycheck. But the lowest, the lowest paycheck, if you like,